Hey folks, happy Thursday. It's wild. I counted down how many days we have left, and we have four more health lessons after this, not including the days where we do, the extension activities, which are obviously optional. So, wow, four more lessons left. As you know, if you've been watching these mini lessons, obviously we can't really do all of the sex ed stuff we'd normally do online. In part, we have fewer lessons. In part, usually we have NYU Langone come in and do a lot of sex ed stuff related to condoms and STD prevention. Usually Bryce from downstairs comes in. And so obviously that's really important you get that information. So we are going to do Ms. Shepard has made sure or has promised us that you will get that next year whenever we go back in person. I have no more information on what next year will look like than you do. I find it the same place you and your parents do, usually in the newspaper or online. We will make sure that you get that information. It is one of the things that's hard to teach online without being in person. But all right, today's lesson is what does it mean to give consent? So, here are some reasons why it's important for us to learn and understand consent. So, sexual assault is very common, including in teenagers. So, studies have found that 1 in 14 girls were verbally or physically pressured into having sex during the past year. 1 in 10 high school girls and 1 in 20 high school boys report being forced into sex. Unfortunately, our stats don't usually ask about non binary folks. So, there is not a lot of information on that, except we do know that LGBTQ plus people are at a higher risk of being assaulted. More than 1/3 of acquaintance rape victims are between the age of 14 and 17. And that acquaintance rape is when you are raped by someone that you know, which is actually the most common type of rape. 1 in 3 girls is a victim of sexual abuse or other abuse by a dating partner each year. About 9% of high school students are physically hurt, meaning on purpose, by a boyfriend or girlfriend or partner of some other type. And almost 20% of college women reported experiencing sexual assault on campus. Based on my friend group, that was even higher. It depends on the thing. So you might be asking, how are sexual assault and rape defined? So sexual assault is defined differently by state if we're looking at the laws. But often people will use the term sexual assault to refer to any kinds of non-consensual sex act or contact. And rape is any non-consensual, meaning you didn't agree to it, sex act that includes penetration of some type. Anyone can be a victim. So we have this idea often like a girl is raped or sexually assaulted by a boy, but that's not always the case. So no matter your gender, your sexual orientation, or your age, people can be victims of sexual assault and rape. Certain groups of people, however, are more likely than others to experience sexual assault in their lives. Women, especially women of color, LGBT identified people, and people with developmental disabilities are more likely to experience sexual assault over the course of their lifetimes. Sexual assault is often underreported because there's a lot of stigma, which we kind of remember as like prejudice and shame. And historically, the court often doesn't convict because they make it very hard to prove sexual assault. So there is underreporting in all groups, but especially folks who are considered like quote unquote not to be victims, like men underreport sexual assault even more than women. But if you look at the reports, people have this idea sometimes like people are always falsely accusing others of being sexually assaulted. But actually, if you look at false reporting, sexual assault is falsely reported less often than other things. So it's interesting, right, that when people talk about sexual assault, sometimes they're like, well, but what if they didn't happen? What if it's a false report? But I almost never hear people having that conversation if someone like has their purse stolen or their bicycle stolen. There's rarely a conversation of like, well, what if they faked it? So it's interesting to kind of look at sort of the types of prejudice and sexism around our discussions of sexual assault. All right. Sexual violence doesn't happen in one single way. There doesn't need to be a weapon involved. The victim doesn't need to have fought back, screamed, or said no repeatedly in order for it to count as rape or sexual assault. Most sexual assaults don't happen by strangers in dark alleyways. So this is kind of showing you many of the ways that we see this happen on TV or that we talk about it. It's not actually true. It's more often someone the victim knows or even someone they're dating or hooking up with or married to. If you see you or someone you know has experienced this type of violence, you're not alone, and there's a lot of help available. Now, it's important that we talk about consent. So when we talk about consent, it means at the time of the act, there are words and physical actions indicating that both partners freely agree and really want to do the same thing. Checking for consent is a process that each person needs to keep doing. So my question for you right now is, besides sex, when are some other times that you should have consent? Right? So maybe you said, really anytime that you're doing something with another person, hugging, right? Maybe you and this other person are close, your best friend, they always feel comfortable hugging, and you kind of already have consent. You still want to like kind of check their body language. Like if you go to hug someone and they like shrink away, maybe they don't feel like being hugged right now. And then in the beginning of the year, with your math teachers, you guys talked about consent and taking photos and things like that when posting online. So, as this cartoon says, everybody gets to make choices about what's comfortable for them. When we define consent, we're looking at 5 things. Freely given. Consenting is a choice you make without pressure, manipulation, or under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So you can't give consent legally if you're drunk or high. So if you are having sex with someone or something similar and they're drunk or high, they actually are not legally consenting to that. But it also means, it's not consent if you're like, oh, come on, like really, it'll be okay. And you like pressure someone into doing it. That's not consent really, because they haven't freely given it. Reversible. Anyone can change their mind about what they feel like doing anytime. So even if you've had sex before, or you've made out before, or even if you get all the way to be naked in bed, and then you're like, no, I don't want to do this. Like, reversible. You can change your mind at any time. Consent is informed. You can only consent to something if you have the full story. For example, if someone says they'll use a condom and then they don't, that isn't full consent because that's not what they have consented to. And enthusiastic. When it comes to sex, you should only do stuff you want to do, not things you feel you're expected to. So it's, for it to be a true consent, someone really wants to do it. It's not just they're like, yeah, because like this is just what I'm supposed to do, I guess. And consent is specific. So saying yes to one thing, like going into the bedroom to make out, doesn't mean you're saying yes to others, like having sex. And often when we talk about consent, it sounds like negative, right? We're like, if it's not consent, it's assault. And so you have to make sure you have consent so it's not assault. But the other part of consent that's important that we often forget in sex ed is that consent is about pleasure and enjoyment. So whatever you and the other person or people are doing should be fun for everyone. You want to make sure your partner or partners is having fun, that you're having fun, and consent and having a healthy conversation around that will make it better, right? You want to make sure not just that it's safe and respectful, but that there's pleasure involved. And just a few things you should know. So people are often like, oh, but it's so awkward to ask for consent. Well, yes, it can be, but also silliness and awkwardness are normal and healthy parts of sexual activity. There are weird faces and noises and fluids, and you have to figure out how to talk about it. Consent should be mutual, both partners, and continual. So every time you switch to a new activity, even if you've engaged in this activity in the past, means you have to make sure people are still okay. So if I wanted ice cream yesterday, that does not mean I necessarily want ice cream today and every day on. In this case, wanting ice cream is a metaphor for a sexual act. And it's the responsibility of both partners to check in. Like, is this okay with you along the way? It's not just if it's a girl and a boy, the boy has to check in. Everyone needs to make sure that they're okay. Also, since it can be hard for a person to speak up when they feel uncomfortable or when they're in a bad situation, it's important for the person initiating, meaning starting a new sexual activity, to ask for consent. So if you're making out and then you're switching to something else, make sure that the person who's switching has the okay. Make sure everyone is okay. All right, now the last thing we're going to do is we're going to watch this video, which is about tea. And tea, in this case, is a metaphor for sex.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea. Thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea at all.
So consent around tea, consent around sex, there's some similarities. If someone says no, says maybe, you can make the tea. But if they change their mind and decide they don't want tea or, sex, you can't make them do it.
Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes, please. That's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it, going, "But you wanted tea last week." Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat, going, "But you wanted tea last night." If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.